Tonight, dozens of employees at Jack Links in Mankato will be looking for new jobs this week after the company's decision to eliminate its third shift. KEYC's Evan Berg reached out to the company to find out more about the staff members who were affected and what lies ahead.
Over 30 employees at Jack Links Mankato location are looking for new work coming out of this weekend as the company decided to cut its third shift to focus on finances and efficiency. An employee of Jack Links who wished to remain anonymous gave KEYC a copy of the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act notice listing the ages and positions of those affected. As part of the disclosure, the company is quoted saying, in order to improve operational efficiencies across its stick network and as a result of financial considerations, the company is eliminating the third shift at its Mankato facility, as well as reducing its first shift packaging operations. As a result, the company is reducing its workforce and eliminating certain positions. End quote. Of the almost 200 positions that were evaluated, around 35 would be let go with severance, and 6 would have the option to relocate within the company or be let go as well. In a statement about the decision, a company spokesperson said, quote, "We are working closely with them and providing support for the less than 1% of North American team members impact. Our commitment to our people, communities, and long-term growth remains strong." End quote. As part of a separation agreement, some affected employees were promised a sum of over $4,200, approximating 5 weeks of their base salary, in exchange for waiving their right to future legal disputes and not disclose any confidential information, including the agreement itself. In Mankato, Evan Berg, KEYC News Now.
Jack Links is currently listed as one of the top 20 employees in the Mankato area by Greater Mankato Growth, which last polled the company as having 249 full-time employees from around the community.